Aristotle once suggested something that sounds unreasonable until you begin to see it in your own life, that a man surrounded by abundance can still live in a state of quiet poverty, not because he lacks resources, but because what he depends on has no strength. Walk slowly through the remains of an ancient city, not as a visitor, but as someone looking for evidence. The marble is cracked, the edges are worn. Time has passed without apology, and yet, what remains still carries weight. There is no urgency in it, no attempt to impress you, no decoration meant to convince you of its importance. It simply stands. And that is what makes it unsettling. Because when you return to modern life, you begin to notice the opposite. Everything moves, everything flashes, everything competes for attention. And yet, very little feels like it will last. I did not notice this all at once. It began as a quiet irritation. Small things. The way decisions felt rushed, the way spending felt automatic, the way effort did not always lead to stability. Nothing was collapsing, but nothing felt anchored. Let me ask you something carefully. Have you ever had the feeling that your life is working, but not holding? That things move forward, but never settle into place? The Greeks would not call this progress. They would call it misalignment. A structure that is active, but not stable. And stability was everything to them. They did not build for speed. They built for permanence. And permanence requires something modern life avoids. Restraint, not limitation, control. I did not begin with admiration for their system. I began with doubt, because it seemed too rigid, too slow, too restrictive. But I also could not ignore the contrast. They built things that still stand. We build things that need constant repair. So I decided to test something, not intellectually, practically. For 10 days, I would follow a set of principles derived from how the Greeks approached wealth, behavior, and daily living, not to become wealthy, but to understand something, why their structures lasted, while ours require constant correction. At first, I did not define the rules clearly. I only removed what felt excessive: speed, noise, unnecessary decisions. And almost immediately, something felt wrong. Not externally, internally. It felt like I was falling behind, as if I had stepped out of a current that was still pulling everything else forward. And the world continued moving. But I had slowed, and that created tension, because modern life punishes stillness. It interprets it as weakness. Let me ask you something directly. When you are not moving, do you feel in control, or do you feel like you are losing ground? Because that feeling is not accidental. It is trained. By the second day, the discomfort increased. Not because I was doing something difficult, but because I was no longer doing things automatically. Simple decisions became deliberate. Spending required thought, actions required justification, and that felt inefficient. But the Greeks did not optimize for efficiency. They optimized for structure, because efficiency without structure leads to collapse. This is where something became visible. Much of what I considered normal was not designed. It was inherited. Patterns adopted without question, habits formed without intention. And those habits were shaping outcomes. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Which parts of your financial life were consciously built, and which parts simply happened? Because anything that simply happens can erode without warning. By the third day, a separation began to form, not clearly, but enough to notice. The difference between what felt urgent and what was actually important. And the gap between those two was larger than I expected. The Greeks did not confuse urgency with importance. They treated urgency as suspicion, because urgency often comes from outside, and what comes from outside cannot always be trusted. Let me ask you something. How many of your financial decisions are driven by urgency, deadlines, opportunities, pressure? And how often do you stop to ask, who created that urgency? By the fourth day, the experiment became heavier, not in effort, in awareness. I began to notice how often I reacted, to information, to prices, to other people's actions. And reaction is not control, it is response. And response means something else has already moved you. The Greeks avoided this. They built systems that allowed them to act, not react, because reaction is unstable. Let me ask you something carefully. If your financial decisions are reactions, who is actually in control? By the fifth day, I understood why most people would never follow this path. It removes comfort. Not physical comfort, mental comfort. The comfort of not questioning. The comfort of acting without thinking. And the comfort of believing that movement equals progress. All of that disappears. And what replaces it is responsibility. The Greeks did not separate wealth from responsibility. To them, they were the same structure. Because without responsibility, wealth cannot be held. Let me ask you something directly. If your income increased tomorrow, would your structure be strong enough to hold it? Or would it create more pressure? By the sixth day, something began to stabilize. Not externally, internally. Decisions became slower, but more certain. Less adjustment, less correction, and that created something unexpected. Energy. Not from doing more, from doing less, correctly. The Greeks would recognize this immediately. They did not believe in constant activity. They believed in precise action, because precision reduces waste, and waste is the silent enemy of wealth. Let me ask you something. How much of your effort is wasted on actions that do not move you forward? By the seventh day, modern life began to feel different. Not wrong, weak, not because it lacked resources, but because it lacked structure. Everything depended on momentum, constant input, continuous movement. Remove that, and things began to collapse. The Greeks did not build like this. Their systems could withstand stillness, because they were built on foundations, not momentum. Let me ask you something carefully. If you stopped pushing your life forward for 1 week, what would remain standing? By the 8th day, clarity became uncomfortable, because once you see instability, you cannot ignore it. And patterns that once felt normal, now felt fragile. Decisions that once felt smart, now felt reactive. And modern life began to look like a system built on speed, not strength. The Greeks would call this poor architecture, a structure designed to impress, but not endure. Let me ask you something. Are you building something that looks successful, or something that will last? Because those are not the same. By the 9th day, there was no desire to return to the previous way, not because it was bad, but because it was exposed. And once something is exposed, it loses its power over you. The Greeks understood this. They trained perception before action. Because what you see clearly, you are less likely to misuse. Let me ask you something directly. What in your life continues to control you, simply because you have not examined it closely? By the 10th day, the experiment ended, but something remained. Not a strategy, a standard, a way of evaluating everything. Does this have structure, or does it depend on something unstable? That question alone changed everything, because once you ask it, you begin to remove what cannot hold, and what remains becomes stronger. The Greeks did not chase wealth. They built systems that could support it, because without support, wealth becomes pressure, and pressure reveals weakness. Let me ask you one final question. If everything in your life were tested, not for speed, but for strength, what would remain? Because in the end, arete is not about what you gain, it is about what you can sustain. And as Epictetus wrote, wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants.